Good afternoon, and welcome to this presentation entitled Creating Habitat with Secondary Effluent While Meeting NPDES Treatment Requirements. My name is Leila Barker, and I'm a Water Resources Analyst at Clean Water Services. I will be talking about the design, construction, and performance of the Fernhill Natural Treatment System in Forest Grove. Before I start, a quick overview of Clean Water Services, or CWS. Clean Water Services is a water resources management utility that performs resource recovery, surface water management, water security and planning, and river flow management. We serve nearly 600,000 residents inside the urban growth boundary of Washington County, and we have a close working relationship with the county, including a shared board. Our services include 4 wastewater treatment facilities, a municipal separate storm sewer program, as well as river flow management and water quality and stream enhancement projects. To explain why Clean Water Services wanted to build a natural treatment system, I first have to give you an overview of the watershed that CWS operates in. In the Tualatin River Basin, CWS has 4 treatment facilities along the Tualatin River, 2 of which are advanced treatment facilities, the Rock Creek and Durham plants. These 2 plants are considered advanced because they provide tertiary level treatment with ammonia and phosphorus removal and filtration. Prior to building the NTS, during the low-flow dry season, which is typically May or June through October, only the advanced Rock Creek and Durham plants discharged into the river, because low flows result in stringent nutrient limitations, which the 2 smaller treatment plants were not designed to meet. Instead, the Hillsborough and Forest Grove plants pumped their wastewater over to Rock Creek facility for treatment during the dry season. With large tech companies like Nike and Intel, more people are moving into this area. The Rock Creek facility is in a particularly populous sewer shed with little room to expand its capacity to address this population growth and the increased flows. So we had to look for alternative ways to continue to meet our high standards for treatment. In the end, we decided to add dry season discharge from the Forest Grove facility. But we didn't want to just upgrade the Forest Grove plant to include tertiary treatment. We wanted to go with a more sustainable treatment system option. Rather than using gray infrastructure and associated pumps and chemicals to treat water, the NTS provides these functions. This approach will help offload some of the flows from the Rock Creek plant onto the Forest Grove facility and allow for population growth in the Rock Creek sewer shed, and will also provide ecological and community benefits. Before I launch into talking about the Fernhill NTS, I first wanted to note the water quality issues that drove the design of the natural treatment system. The Tualatin River has TMDLs and water quality standards for phosphorus, ammonia, and temperature. As a result, Clean Water Services treatment plants have very stringent effluent limits for these parameters that are based on the TMDLs. To meet the strict effluent limits, Clean Water Services decided to use an approach which combined conventional treatment at the Forest Grove plant with natural treatment at the Fernhill NTS. The Forest Grove wastewater treatment facility is used to meet most effluent permit parameters: BOD, TSS, bacteria, etc. As the NTS was being designed, it was decided to focus on optimizing operations of the treatment plant to focus on biological phosphorus removal. As a result, the natural treatment system was designed for ammonia and temperature reduction, which you'll see as I walk through the rest of this presentation. The Tualatin River is a relatively small stream compared to many of the other rivers that treatment facilities discharge into, the Willamette and the Rogue, for example. Flows in the river can get down to less than 200 CFS in the summertime, and CWS's effluent discharge often makes up over a third of the stream flow in the lower part of the river during that time. The first TMDL in Oregon was written for the Tualatin Basin in the 1980s for ammonia and phosphorus. These TMDLs were revised in 2001, and new TMDLs were established for temperature, bacteria, and DO in tributaries of the basin. The TMDLs for ammonia and phosphorus were amended again in 2012. At the left, you can see the location of the Forest Grove plant and Fernhill NTS within our watershed. The dashed line is Washington County, and the green is the Tualatin River watershed. Gray is the CWS service district. The complex is located south of the city of Forest Grove, as you can see in the map at right. This is the Fernhill Wetlands with the Forest Grove Wastewater Treatment Facility in the northwest corner. From here, the water will flow into the west wetlands, which is where the vertical flow wetlands are located. Their purpose is primarily for removing ammonia via nitrification. From there, the water flows into a demonstration wetland, where different plant species are tested to determine how well they will do in this environment. Then water flows into the south wetlands, which were designed primarily for the purpose of temperature reduction. The south wetlands has about 80% vegetation cover and features half a dozen cells with alternating shallow and deep zones. From the south wetlands, the water is then discharged to the Tualatin River at the south end. The area at the upper right in green, which is currently referred to as the upper wetlands, is yet to be built but may eventually be developed as an additional treatment process. So first off, what is a treatment wetland? As the name implies, a wetland is land that is wet or submerged for part or all of the year. A treatment wetland is a wetland that is engineered or constructed and uses natural processes involving vegetation, soils, and microbiology to improve the quality of municipal, industrial, or agricultural wastewater or stormwater. A treatment wetland can provide standalone secondary treatment in some regions, or tertiary treatment of secondary discharges. Benefits include little to no chemical requirements, low energy costs, and they're attractive. Limitations may include the fact that there's a large area required for operation, and there's inherent variation in natural systems, which can mean less predictable treatment efficiencies, making it harder to meet regulatory requirements that are designed for traditional gray infrastructure. In addition to water quality treatment, treatment wetlands can provide other functions such as water storage, habitat for plants, fish, birds, and other wildlife, and education and recreational resources. Water quality treatment is complex and depends on a host of factors, including flow rates, climate, temperature, wind, evapotranspiration, and so on, soil and plant types, and operational strategies. Removal mechanisms include sedimentation, precipitation, adsorption, microbial processes, filtration, volatilization, and plant uptake. Sometimes multiple mechanisms may work on same parameters. Nitrogen removal can occur due to nitrification and denitrification in biofilms or due to plant uptake. Phosphorus removal can occur due to plant uptake, retention and adsorption in the soil, or precipitation, along with things like calcium, aluminum, and iron. Numerous types of treatment wetlands exist, and they can be broadly broken down into surface flow and subsurface flow wetlands. As I mentioned earlier, the first stage of the natural treatment system at Forest Grove is a vertical flow wetland. And the purpose of this wetland is ammonia oxidation. And vertical flow wetlands, by design, provide higher levels of oxygen transfer than horizontal flow wetlands because you're dragging oxygen into the system as you operate it. And thereby, they promote rapid ammonia oxidation and nitrification. A horizontal flow wetland has lower oxygen transfer capabilities and the potential for clogging. Another advantage of going with a vertical flow wetland is the fact that it has an ability to operate in different operational flow modes. It can either be used in kind of a trickling mode, or it can be filled up and drained like a bathtub. Vertical flow wetlands are composed of gravel or soil and can be planted with wetland vegetation at the top. They are fed either continuously or with a fill and drain operation, depending on preferences or treatment needs. And they provide, as I mentioned earlier, very high levels of oxygen transfer that aid nitrification. So this is a cross-sectional view. There are actually two processes at work in the vertical flow wetland that result in ammonia oxidation: a physical absorption process and biological nitrification. If you were to zoom in on the rock media as the water flows vertically through the wetlands, you would see that the ammonia in the water adsorbs onto the surface of the rock media. The key to this process is using rocks with an especially high affinity for adsorbing ammonia. For the vertical flow wetlands at Fernhill, pilot testing was conducted and rocks with high ammonia exchange capacity were selected. Additionally, as the water flows through the wetlands, oxygen is pulled into the system. And biofilms that are growing on the rock media use that oxygen to nitrify the ammonia to nitrate. Nitrogen thereby desorbs from the rock media and re-enters the water column, and the rock media is available to absorb more ammonia. An even distribution of water across the surface of the vertical flow wetland is really important to ensure that there's no short-circuiting that occurs during operation. For that to take place, when the 12 cells of the vertical flow wetland were constructed, each of them was built with 37 standpipes for a total of 444 standpipes, all at evenly spaced increments about 12 feet apart from each other across the wetlands. Shown here is a view of the distribution system as the wetland was being built. This is prior to the addition of the final layer of rock. And here we have some pictures of the vertical flow wetland in operation shortly after it was constructed. At the left, you can see it operating in continuous or trickling flow mode. And at the right, you can see it in tidal or fill and drain mode, just as it is filling and shortly before the entire cell drains. You can note the standpipes at their 12-foot spacing. We decided not to introduce vegetation to the vertical flow wetland for a few months after construction because we wanted to evaluate the hydraulics of the system as well as to make decisions about what kinds of plants would do best in this environment. However, it didn't take very long before we had volunteers. As it turned out, tomatoes really thought that this nutrient-rich environment was the place to be, and in the first few months of operation we counted 140 or more tomato plants growing in the top layer of the vertical flow wetland. They looked delicious, but nobody actually wanted to try them. They constituted about 90% of the plants that decided to volunteer. More recently, we have intentionally planted local reeds and sedges in the wetland. Next, I'm going to talk about the south wetlands, which are shown here in yellow. The south wetlands are a surface flow wetland and were designed with the primary goal of reducing temperatures coming out of the treatment plant in order to improve water quality and habitat for aquatic species in the Tualatin River. The south wetlands are about 90 acres and were designed with a hydraulic retention time of about 4 to 5 days when the system is operated at a flow rate of 5 million gallons per day. The entire south wetlands complex was designed for passive flow and is open to the public with a series of walking trails. The south wetlands were constructed on the site of former sewage lagoons. Construction began in 2014 and involved moving 250,000 cubic yards of soil within the site to modify the topography. In addition, CWS brought in 180 vertical snags and sill logs to provide areas for birds to perch as well as for habitat. 750,000 plants were brought in, and we also introduced 3.2 billion, with a B, seeds. As I mentioned, the south wetlands are operated via passive flow, and so there are 15 weirs in the complex. The next few pictures document some of the construction process. This is a view looking north toward the treatment plant in 2014 as earth moving was happening. This is the same view after the grading was completed and some of the vertical snags and horizontal logs were installed. And this is in the first season following the introduction of vegetation. As you can see, it took off pretty quickly. Planting took place starting in 2015, and additional vegetation was installed in targeted locations in the following years. The south wetlands officially came online as a treatment process in the summer of 2017. So the overlay on what is a highly valued natural area gave CWS an opportunity to focus the planting approach in order to target a native, diverse mix of plants to encourage a mix of wildlife use. So a lot of treatment wetlands rely on cattails, especially if you're looking at temperature reduction. Cattails tend to be very good at that. However, if we're looking at things like habitat, cattails would only really benefit a few species. They were not included in the planting plan, but because they're native and they're fairly hardy, they have shown up on the site. But it was kind of important to try to avoid a dominance of a single species. When farming, we typically want to grow a monoculture, so we treat the land the same. Jared Kinnear, our wetland scientist, likes to say that he considers mitigation and enhancement similar to farming. And when you grade the land pretty evenly, it works at growing a pretty good monoculture. So what Jared did was he started with the soil and wanted to get a little bit of diversity in the topography. So rather than having it completely flat, he added in a little bit of diversity. Plant species can be extremely sensitive to minor changes in elevation, especially when there's water involved, because that means a difference of inches to feet in how deep the water is. So this meant that it gave an opportunity for some small changes in elevation to potentially make a big difference. So what Jared did was he basically sent out the construction guys in their rigs and told them, once they had graded it really nice and flat, to have a little bit of fun and dig in a couple places, maybe add a little bit of dirt in a few places, and just make it not perfectly level. So how well did that work? If you look at this picture here, you can see that there are some vertical lines of darker green, and what that is water parsley that managed to sprout in the troughs that were created. So water parsley is a deep aquatic plant, and this highlights the niche of the wetland plants to grow where they have the best opportunity to survive. I also wanted to point out in the top left you have a vegetated coir log, so that's coconut fiber, and this was the contingency plan for helping to prevent short-circuiting of flows. We really didn't want to have to regrade or use machinery because that would mean getting in there and disturbing plants. So the idea was to take, if they were needed, to take these coir logs and install them by hand if any sort of short-circuiting of flow was detected, and to try to use that to direct flows and make sure that treatment was occurring in a more plug flow fashion. We carry out annual plant surveys in the NTS, and the findings have been pretty encouraging so far. So these are results from 2017 in the various cells. So the cells in the wetland are numbered in the order which water flows through. So we have 1A, 1B, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. The vast majority of the plants that are found are native vegetation, which is really encouraging. Most of those were planted, but there are actually a number of species that have introduced themselves in the years since 2014, 2015. There are a few non-native plants that we try to keep out through weeding annually, but they are a pretty small percentage. And the vast majority of the area is vegetated. On the bottom right, you can see a measure of species richness. That effective number of species in red there is a conversion of the Shannon-Weiner Diversity Index into a number of equally abundant species that are necessary to produce the diversity value that's calculated for the community. Whereas the blue number, the species richness, is a simple count of the number of species that are occurring no matter what degree of cover they produce. I do kind of want to point out that those numbers are fairly low in cell 5, and the reason for that is that cell 5 was the cell that was largely colonized by cattails, which is Not exactly what we were going for in the entire NTS, but if it's relatively limited to one cell, we can live with that, especially since they're good for temperature. So we do carry out a fair amount of monitoring in the wetlands. As I mentioned, we look at vegetation and with an eye to diversity and how much cover there is, because a certain amount of cover is required in order to reduce temperatures in the water and promote evapotranspiration and shading. We also look at macroinvertebrate populations and do a lot of water quality monitoring, looking at temperature, nutrients, dissolved oxygen, pH, contaminants of emerging concern, as well as metals. There are also bird surveys that are conducted by the Audubon Society, as well as bat surveys and bee surveys. And we also look at other measures of the diversity of wildlife. This is a new system, and it's at a very large scale, and so it's really important to us to try to understand the impacts and look at how to optimize our operation of the natural treatment system, not only for water quality, but also for habitat. So there are two parameters for which the permit requirements are met at the natural treatment system outfall, as opposed to at the treatment plant. And those are temperature and dissolved oxygen. The NTS came online in 2017, and for the first 2 seasons, we conducted testing under a mutual agreement and order with DEQ. And the goals of that testing were to help us to evaluate how the system was performing, as well as to optimize our operations. And crucially, it also allowed time for the vegetation to mature. We installed a large number of temperature continuous monitoring devices throughout the wetlands in very densely vegetated areas, as well as open water zones, and a few within the pond as well. And we also installed some DO continuous monitoring devices. In addition to that, we had some at the outlet structure. And our goals here were to look at the cooling effects of the vegetation and to identify any areas of concern. And specifically with the outlet structure monitors, we were hoping to determine our compliance and work on informing the operational decisions that were needed to improve performance. This graph shows temperatures over the course of several weeks at the beginning and end of a highly vegetated zone. As you can see, temperature has a lot of diurnal variation in a wetland. There is a range of several degrees, and one thing that's really interesting to note is that the cooling effects really start to be noticeable when flows get up to around 3 million gallons per day. Our permit limit for temperature is a daily maximum of 25 degrees Celsius, which is 77 degrees Fahrenheit. Typically, when flows are high, the temperatures stay below this level at all times during the day as the water gets to the outlet structure. However, on particularly hot days, or if flow is interrupted, temperatures at the outlet can increase. And because of this, we program the outlet gate to shut if temperatures get within 1 or 2 degrees of that maximum 25 Celsius. So occasionally the gate will shut on a summer afternoon, and then it'll reopen several hours later at night once the water has cooled down again. The second parameter with a permit limit at the NTS outfall is dissolved oxygen. Unlike temperature, the DO limit is written as a daily average. Our permit limit is 6 milligrams per liter or higher as a daily average. In a natural wetland, DO can be quite low. 1 to 2 milligrams per liter is common under some circumstances. The outfall structure was designed with an aeration staircase to increase the dissolved oxygen prior to discharge. In a wetland, DO is largely driven by algal activity, which means that it tends to peak at the height of the afternoon when the sun is brightest. This means that it flips the typical scenario where we think of DO saturation being highest at low temperatures. Instead, DO is highest when the sun is out, and consequently when the water is warmest. So this means that when the discharge gate closes to prevent discharge of water that might be getting close to the temperature limit, that typically happens in the middle of the afternoon at times when dissolved oxygen is high, and on its own, high DO discharge is desirable. So this is an illustration of how permit numbers can be more challenging to meet in a natural treatment system. On average, the temperature of water in the NTS may be well below the daily maximum permit limit, but because there's that really high degree of diurnal variation, this benefit is not captured in the permit structure because our permit limit for temperature is only focused on the maximum. The aeration stairs in the NTS outfall structure are still a valuable tool for increasing dissolved oxygen. This is a picture taken looking down a hatch into the outfall structure at the stairs, and as you can see, the turbulence brings a lot of oxygen into the water. But later in the summer, as algal activity drops, there are times when a little additional help is needed. We also observed a sharp drop in DO last September when the fires were raging across Oregon and smoke from the fires blocked the sun and caused a steep drop in algal activity. After a period of evaluation, we installed aerators in the outlet structure to ensure that effluent DO always meets permit regardless of weather. Because this is a new system and one of the largest of its kind, we are still learning a lot about its impacts on water quality. As you'll see in the next few slides, the NTS has big impacts on nutrient levels as well as on some metals. Algae are another area of interest for several reasons. Because of its location in the watershed, algae that grow in the natural treatment system have the potential to act as a seed for populations that grow downstream as water travels down the Tualatin River. As a result, we're interested in operational strategies for promoting the good kinds of algae, such as green algae and diatoms. These species have demonstrated the potential to enhance dissolved oxygen levels in the lower river. We also want to avoid promoting growth of cyanobacteria and so-called HABs, or harmful algal blooms, which are not so desirable. First, I'll talk a little bit about our nutrient removal data. So as I mentioned at the very beginning of this presentation, the natural treatment system was constructed in order to enable dry season discharge from the Forest Grove Wastewater Treatment Facility. So the default winter flow path is directly from the wastewater treatment facility to the river. However, during the summer, we have flow going from the treatment facility through the vertical flow wetland and then down into the 90 plus acres of the south wetlands through to the NTS effluent and then to the river. This is a graph of ammonia. Red squares are levels at the treatment plant effluent. The triangles are the vertical flow wetland effluent, so that's the effluent from the nitrifying wetland. And the circles are the effluent from the entire natural treatment system, that's the surface flow wetland. So you'll note that some of those levels at the treatment plant effluent are really high, and as I mentioned back at the top of the presentation, there were times when the treatment plant was being operated intentionally not to nitrify and instead to focus on phosphorus removal. So that gives us a pretty interesting data set to look at the performance of the vertical flow wetland. So what you'll note is that the VFW tends to oxidize about 70% of the ammonia nitrogen at times that the treatment plant is operated to avoid nitrification. And because the vertical flow wetland was designed for nitrification, in our permit, the compliance point can either be the treatment plant, or if the vertical flow wetland is online, it can be the vertical flow wetland. You'll note there, with the blue circles representing the natural treatment system effluent, that most of the residual ammonia is removed. If it isn't removed in the vertical flow wetland, it's definitely removed by the time it gets through the surface wetlands. Next up is nitrate, and you will notice that there is considerably higher nitrate in the vertical flow wetland effluent than in the treatment plant effluent. And that is simply because the vertical flow wetland is oxidizing all of that ammonia that we talked about into nitrate. There is pretty much a one-to-one conversion of that ammonia to nitrate. There's no denitrification that happens in the vertical flow wetland. However, there's a lot of denitrification that happens in the natural treatment system, as you'll see if you look at those blue circles. Concentrations are reduced to less than 1 milligram per liter in the NTS. That typically happens year-round as well. There's removal even in winter, and that microbial denitrification is continuing even as the plants are dormant. Nitrate is not a permit parameter for us. And next up is total killed-all nitrogen. If you compare these results to the ammonia results from 2 slides ago, you'd see that virtually all of the TKN is in the form of ammonia, and this holds for all 3 of the sample locations. So what about phosphorus? This graph is of total phosphorus, and I'm not showing the vertical flow wetland because it wasn't designed to remove phosphorus, so I'm just leaving it out. You can see that there's substantial removal of phosphorus in the NTS. However, most of the data we have currently are from the growing season. There are still a lot of questions about what happens to phosphorus in the long term. Unlike nitrogen, which can go into the atmosphere when it's denitrified, phosphorus stays tied up in either biomass or in sediment, in plants, or in the water column. So it has to go somewhere. We currently have testing that's ongoing to evaluate the winter conditions and determine if we expect removal to continue this way, or if we're going to start to see cycles of phosphorus uptake followed by phosphorus release in the winter. And now we come to soluble orthophosphate. This time I am showing the vertical flow wetland data, and this is just simply to illustrate that the VFW really doesn't have any effect on phosphorus, even as it's oxidizing quite a lot of ammonia. Orthophosphate is nearly completely removed in the NTS, as was total phosphorus. Again, as with total phosphorus, we still don't have very much winter data, so we're working on collecting that. Changing gears a little bit, I'm going to talk about metals, and in particular copper. Copper can occur naturally and as a result of stormwater runoff, domestic wastewater, or industrial processes. It's not really a human health concern, but even low levels can be toxic to some aquatic species. In Oregon, we're particularly concerned about salmonid species. Concentrations as low as a few parts per billion can bind to their olfactory receptors and impair navigation and predator avoidance, which can lead to higher mortality for fish. Wastewater treatment plants do remove copper, but not always to extremely low parts per billion levels. Copper toxicity is dependent on water quality characteristics, and free ionic copper tends to be thought of as the most toxic form. When copper forms complexes and precipitates, or it binds to organics in plants or sediments, it becomes less bioavailable and less toxic. Our monitoring over the last few years has indicated that the NTS does a very effective job of removing copper from the water column, both particulate copper as well as soluble copper. The graph here includes some times when the natural treatment system was not discharging, but the times with the background in white are when the NTS was discharging, and you see that decrease in both the total and the soluble form of copper. The Forest Grove facility has a 1010 TSS CBOD limit in the dry season, but there's something a little bit odd about having these limits when the plant is discharging to a wetland, which is going to produce plant matter, microbes, and assorted organics. We've been looking at this data for a shorter time, so long-term trends still need to be evaluated. Interestingly, for the 2020 growing season, levels of both of these parameters were typically lower at the end of the natural treatment system than in the treatment plant effluent. Treatment wetlands can remove trace chemicals via several methods. These include adsorption, uptake, and biotransformation, among others. Clean Water Services has partnered with Oregon State University to look at trace organic compounds and to compare treatment plant effluent to what we see in the natural treatment system. For this study, filtered water samples were concentrated using aqueous solid phase extraction. Mass spec, or GCMS, was then used to identify some of the trace organic compounds. At top right, you can see some of the mass spec results. At bottom right, there are library results for a chemical called nonanone, and you can note how the compounds match. To look at dissolved organic matter, fluorescence fingerprinting was performed on filtered samples. This was done with a fluorescent sodium salt, and the concentration of the fluorescent compound is indicated by the intensity of the emission spectra. For those results, we tended to see that in general, the NTS samples showed lower intensities, which indicated a reduction in soluble compound concentration. This was just the first set of data, however, so we're still waiting on more results from the dry season. As you might expect, the microbial community in the natural treatment system is somewhat different from the microbial community in the treatment plant. The researchers at OSU have also been working on trying to identify what kinds of species we see in treatment plant effluent as well as in the natural treatment system. This slide here demonstrates the results from ASV, or amplicon sequence variant analysis. An amplicon sequence variant is an individual DNA sequence, and you can have thousands of copies of a specific ASV that are identified when you're doing DNA sequencing. At the left we have bacteria, and at the right we have archaea. These initial data indicate that the microbial diversity decreases as water travels through the NTS. Most bacterial species don't survive in the 4 to 5 days of travel through the wetlands, and a different population gets generated in the NTS. The green lines at the top are that are labeled FG are the treatment plant effluent samples, and those brown or orange lines are the natural treatment system effluent samples. This Venn diagram illustrates the number of ASVs from the combined samples that survive through the NTS, which is 66, and the number that are generated in the NTS, so 194 minus 66, or 128 new sequences. This graphic shows data on which bacterial phyla were most abundant in samples that were taken from the wastewater treatment plant facility, the bar on the left, and from the natural treatment system effluent, which is the bar on the right. Phylum is the level below kingdom in the taxonomic division, so we didn't get anywhere close to looking at individual species, but it still does give you an interesting breakdown. And you can see that the samples look a little bit different in their distribution. It's very important to note that these samples were taken in December. So we're currently analyzing results from the dry season, but don't have that data available yet. While the NTS was built to accommodate dry season flows, it's also run in the wet season as long as the wetlands are not flooded and the hydraulics permit. When it comes to algae, we're interested both in what we see in the natural treatment system as well as the impacts on seeding downstream in the Tualatin River. There are possible impacts on water quality, particularly on dissolved oxygen, and so we're interested in what we see in terms of good algae as well as bad algae, particularly cyanobacteria, which are also known as blue-green algae. So how to best manage and support the growth of beneficial algae? For the past 2 years, we've been partnering with researchers from USGS who've conducted monitoring and identification of algal species throughout the NTS, as well as downstream in the Tualatin River. And we are looking forward to incorporating their findings into our operational plan for the NTS. That could help us decide on things like water levels that we can adjust with the weir boards, or looking at alterations in the mix of our open water versus vegetative cover ratios. The Fernhill Natural Treatment System addresses the triple bottom line, which is this idea of not only the economic benefits, but also the nexus with social and environmental benefits. When alternatives were being explored, it was estimated that the cost of expanding the Rock Creek treatment facility by building an additional liquid treatment train would be about $31 million. In contrast, the construction cost of the Fernhill NTS was about $18 million. This is in 2010 dollars. In addition to the plant diversity benefits that I discussed earlier, the NTS is right in the middle of the Pacific Migratory Bird Flyway, which is one of the major migratory bird routes in North America. As such, it serves as a stopping point for migratory birds, but it also provides habitat and serves as a year-round home for birds, amphibians, mammals, and insects. It's a top birdwatching destination in Oregon. And then we have the community benefits. As I mentioned before, birdwatching and hiking. We also have elementary STEM partnerships where we bring teachers on site to give them site-specific training. We've also had over 1,000 students come to the site and learn about water quality, native plants, and wildlife, as well as natural treatment systems and wastewater. We have 40 plus volunteer stewards who walk around the site and provide education and orientation for visitors. And we also have bilingual guided walks in English and Spanish. The Fernhill NTS was designed with the input and support of a host of institutions, nonprofits, and local businesses. Design and construction was the product of collaboration with many engineering and consulting firms, as well as with CWS field operations. I'll close with an aerial view of the NTS, taken toward the end of construction, prior to the addition of vegetation. You can see it in the middle of the frame here. As I mentioned earlier, a natural treatment system doesn't fit the current regulatory structure. Standards and effluent limits are written with conventional treatment systems in mind, and the current permitting structure doesn't really make it easy to permit an NTS. As such, significant benefits can be overlooked. For example, focusing on peak temperatures misses a large portion of the story. We continue to carry out research and monitoring in the NTS to learn more about its effects on water quality. In the meantime, visitors continue to come year-round to spot bald eagles, exercise, or just relax. If you haven't already, I hope you'll come visit. I'd like to extend a special thanks to the people listed for sharing some of the content that went into these slides. Thank you so much for watching this presentation. Please feel free to contact me if you've got any questions.